You hear this phrase everywhere now, don't you? Sovereign citizen. It pops up in all sorts of places, legal stuff, viral videos. It really tries to capture this feeling of like ultimate personal freedom, standing outside the usual legal system. But when you actually start to pull at that thread, legally, conceptually, most folks who study this seem to agree. The term itself, it's actually a fundamental contradiction, an oxymoron.
It definitely sounds powerful, that idea of being both sovereign and a citizen. But yeah, the sources you share, they argue pretty strongly that from a purely legal standpoint, those two things just can't occupy the same space. They're mutually exclusive, legally speaking.
Exactly. Yeah, we got some really fascinating material arguing just that sovereign citizen is sort of impossible to be all at once. So our mission today is to really dig into why. Why is it impossible? What are the legal ideas behind it? And what about these mechanisms of consent they talk about? And are there actual, real alternatives to just being a standard citizen? Okay, let's unpack this, starting right there with the basic conflict.
Right. So the core idea, and it's designed to be a bit challenging, is that being a citizen in the state-issued sense and being truly sovereign, they just don't overlap. Sovereignty, in the way these sources define it, it's divine self-governance. It means you're not subject to any outside authority, especially not these legal fictions. The argument is the moment you accept that state-issued citizenship, you've essentially waived that original sovereign status. You've traded it.
Wow. Okay. That really draws a sharp line in the sand immediately. But how does that actually work? What's the mechanism that makes them incompatible? How does, a government paper or status like being a citizen somehow override what they're calling divine self-governance?
Okay, this is where it gets into the weeds a bit, but it's central to their argument. The sources point to a specific legal framework. They say this conflict is enforced under the maritime legal construct. That's what supposedly governs modern legal systems, modern jurisdictions.
Maritime legal construct. Okay, that sounds pretty obscure, doesn't it? Like something to do with ships in the ocean.
It does sound that way, yeah.
Yeah.
People definitely hear maritime law and think, pirates or shipping lanes, maybe. Not things like birth certificates or traffic court.
So how do they connect those dots, maritime law and, say, my driver's license?
Well, the argument laid out in the material is that this maritime construct or admiralty law, it fundamentally governs commerce.
Yeah.
And contracts, and crucially, debt.
Yeah.
The claim is that when a person is registered as a citizen, usually through the birth certificate process, they're unknowingly entered into a system that operates under commercial law. Specifically things like the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC, because the legal entity created by that registration, it's essentially viewed as collateralized debt held by the state.
Ah, okay. So the whole legal structure we interact with daily is, in this view, built around commerce and debt. And being a citizen means you're an entity within that commercial system.
Precisely. That's how the sources argue the system enforces this mutual exclusivity by sort of creating this commercial entity, this legal fiction that's separate from the living, breathing man or woman. So you're either sovereign standing outside that whole debt and commerce framework, or you're a citizen operating inside it, under its rules, under that maritime construct.
Right. That makes the structure of the argument clearer. Which then leads us to the next part, which I found really, really surprising, how this whole separation is actually put into practice. You mentioned the system operates like a maze of consent.
Yeah, that phrase really captures it, doesn't it? The sort of sneaky nature of the process they describe. It's presented as a system where people are constantly being invited, subtly, to give up their sovereignty and step into the role of that legal fiction. And here's the absolute key part. According to these sources, it only requires your compliance. It doesn't require your conscious awareness or understanding.
That's the real kicker, isn't it? Compliance, not awareness.
Exactly. The system, as they describe it, is set up to work whether you grasp the finer legal points or not. Just by complying, you're opting in.
So ignorance isn't just no excuse, it's almost part of the design here. Unconscious compliance is the tool. Okay, so what are these points of compliance then? Where are we making these subtle agreements that, according to the sources, turn a sovereign person into this legal fiction, this citizen? Let's dig into the details of that mechanism, because here's where it gets really compelling. As the source material offers 3 very concrete examples of this alleged waiver.
Yes, these examples are meant to show how we engage with this system maybe every single day without realizing the supposed implications of just going along with it. The first big one they focus on is the birth certificate. The argument isn't that it's just a record of when and where you were born. No, it's viewed in this specific legal context as more like a corporate title. or even a security instrument. The claim is when that birth is registered with the state actually creates a trust entity. It's named after the child, uses their name, and that entity becomes the collateralized debt we talked about under that maritime commercial law structure.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty big conceptual jump. From just a record to a proprietary title held by the state, how do they justify that?
Well, they argue that the registration process essentially creates a second identity parallel to the living person. And this second identity, this paper identity, is technically property of the state until maybe it's reclaimed somehow. Sure. And this leads right into the second example, which is probably the one people recognize most often.
Let me guess, the name in all CKS.
You got it. The use of your name written in all CCAP PS.
Yeah, you see that everywhere. Driver's licenses, bank statements, legal papers. What's the supposed meaning behind the capitalization?
So the sources explain that the name written that way, in all capital letters, that doesn't represent you, the living man or woman. It represents the legal fiction. The corporate trust entity created by the state, the one that operates under commercial law. So every time you sign a document or use an ID where your name is in all cap PS, you are, in this view, complying. You're acknowledging that fiction and its jurisdictions, like this constant low-level agreement.
That's quite something. Just the format of your name becomes an act of consent of acknowledging jurisdiction.
That's the argument, yeah. And the third example they give ties directly into how we interact with the courts, specifically how we view a court summons.
Okay, how does that fit in?
The sources suggest that legally, a summons isn't actually a mandatory order demanding your appearance. It should be viewed more like an invitation to contract. An invitation which, like any contract offer, you theoretically have the option to either accept or decline, or perhaps respond to conditionally, rather than just obeying automatically.
An invitation to contract. So by just showing up to court as summoned, without questioning the jurisdiction or the nature of the summons, you're basically accepting the contract. You're agreeing to their terms and their authority in that instance.
Correct. That's the interpretation offered. If you accept these things, the birth certificate as title, the LLC name, as the fiction you operate under, the summons is a contract you accept by performance, then you've submitted yourself to that system. And being a citizen within that system means you've agreed, consciously or not, to that whole structure of compliance and consent, which again runs completely counter to their definition of sovereignty as inherent divine self-governance. Now, since the sources really hammer home that sovereign citizen is, fundamentally flawed as a term, they also quite logically bring up the idea that standard state citizenship isn't the only game in town. There might be other options. And bringing these up reinforces their main point by showing that there are potentially other lawful defined statuses one could occupy, statuses that exist outside that typical citizen framework.
Okay, this is really important, right? Because it moves beyond just pointing out a problem, like the oxymoron. It starts outlining potential, well, not solutions maybe, but alternatives that are supposedly recognized, at least by some, within the legal system. So what are these specific alternatives they mention, these other statuses?
They name two specific ones, and the sources are careful to say these have a defined legal status with its own standing. It's not just making something up. The first one mentioned is the American National.
American National, okay.
This often involves things like filing certain documents, maybe registering in specific non-governmental registries. The aim is usually to declare oneself as perhaps a citizen of one of the United States as opposed to a federal citizen under the 14th Amendment. It's about asserting a kind of original pre-existing standing, sometimes described as being on the land.
Right, I've heard terminology like that. And the second one, you mentioned another one, secured party creditor. That sounds very commercial.
It does, and that's intentional. What's fascinating here is the claim behind the secured party creditor, or SPC, status. The idea is to try and flip their whole maritime commercial construct we talked about earlier, turn it back on the system, so to speak.
Flip it how?
Well, the claim is that by filing the right kind of paperwork, usually UCC financing statements, you essentially assert your claim over that legal fiction, that all CCAP PS name, that trust entity the state supposedly created with the birth certificate. You become the creditor to that entity rather than the debtor. You're basically claiming ownership and control over the fiction, thereby canceling out the state's claim to it as collateral.
Huh. So the SPC status is like an attempt to legally hijack the commercial entity the state made in your name, to take it back.
That's pretty much the argument they put forward, yes. So the existence of these kinds of alternatives, like American National or SPC, is used to bolster the argument that you don't need the flawed sovereign citizen label. There are other paths, supposedly more legally grounded.
Which leads us to something really crucial that the source material repeats, almost like a warning label. It's vital, practical advice for anyone looking into this stuff. If these statuses exist, why not just declare them? Why not tell a police officer or a judge, I'm an American national, or I'm the secured party creditor?
Yeah, the sources are very clear on this. They strongly, strongly advise against arguing or trying to assert any specific status like that, especially the term sovereign citizen, during any kind of legal encounter. The material basically says doing that will almost certainly just dig you a deeper hole. And it says that's by design.
By design. Why so cautious? Is it just that the system pushes back against it?
Yeah.
Or something else?
It seems to be a mix of both, really. Systemic and just practical. The sources point out that most legal authorities you interact with day to day, police officers, local court officials, municipal figures, they typically just are not properly educated on the nuances. They don't know the difference between a carefully researched status like American national and the, frankly, often misused and legally messy term sovereign citizen. So if you try to force the issue, get confrontational about your status, it's probably just going to cause confusion, maybe suspicion, likely escalation, regardless of how much legal research you've done yourself.
That makes a lot of practical sense, unfortunately, if the person you're talking to doesn't even understand the category you're claiming. Okay, so if the legal system, the courts, the paperwork, if those are complicated, maybe even dangerous places to assert this kind of standing, where does true sovereignty actually live, according to these sources? This seems like we need to shift gears a bit, away from just the legal stuff.
Exactly. There's a definite pivot in the material here. It suggests that chasing paper trails, filing complex documents, getting into legal fights, that might be missing the bigger picture entirely.
Right. They actually say that true sovereignty begins where all those legal paper trails end. It's described as something much deeper, something cellular, energetic, and even divine. It doesn't live in a filing cabinet, basically. It lives in how we speak, how we carry ourselves, how we manage our energy, and maybe most importantly, how we consciously withdraw consent from agreements, especially the ones we made without thinking.
Yes, that reframes the whole thing, doesn't it? If sovereignty is ultimately this divine self-governance, then reclaiming it isn't about fighting the system from the outside. It becomes more of a daily internal practice. And the sources actually outline 3 quite practical internal steps for how someone could start reclaiming that kind of energetic personal sovereignty right now.
Okay, let's walk through those 3, because that offers a very different kind of action compared to navigating the legal maze.
Right. The first one is audit your language. This comes from the idea that words are spells, that language creates reality to some extent. So it's about becoming really conscious, really mindful of the words you use every day. Are you using words that imply you're less than, or that you're giving away responsibility? And then consciously choosing words that reflect self-ownership, self-governance.
That ties right back to that compliance mechanism, doesn't it? How compliance often happens through the language we just use automatically, unconsciously.
Absolutely. It's about making the unconscious conscious. The second step they suggest is to clear energetic contracts. This is more esoteric, perhaps, but it involves making a clear, focused internal declaration. Something like stating your intention to revoke all unconscious agreements that do not serve my sovereignty. It's aimed at severing those unseen ties, those compliant habits, those contracts you might have signed energetically without full awareness or consent.
Auditing language, clearing energetic contracts. And the third step seems to bring back the legal knowledge, but maybe with a different purpose.
Exactly. The third step is know your standing. This doesn't mean arguing it in court necessarily, but rather doing the research. Explore and understand those defined lawful statuses we talked about, like American national or secured party creditor. Understand the legal theories behind them, what they are intended to represent in terms of personal sovereignty. The point here is to educate yourself on established concepts, rather than just relying on a term like sovereign citizen, which, as the sources argue, is legally flawed and often gets people into trouble.
Okay, so putting it all together then, what does this all mean for someone listening trying to make sense of this? We started with this idea that sovereign citizen is an oxymoron, right? Because of the way the maritime legal construct supposedly works. Then we looked at these really specific kind of mind-bending examples of the maze of consent, the birth certificate as a trust, the name in all cap ES being the fiction. And we wrapped up by seeing there are these other potential legal statuses, but also this much deeper, energetic definition of sovereignty. So what's the takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is that The real application of this knowledge, according to the sources, isn't really about finding some clever trick to get out of a speeding ticket, It's much more about consciously defining who you are, your personhood, and being incredibly deliberate about what you consent to and how. Remember that quote you mentioned from the sources, that the most important thing any sovereign can do is become a better part of our communities and show by example what a peaceful man or woman living upon the land truly is.
Yeah, that really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It takes it away from just a technical legal debate about debt and trusts and paperwork and turns it into a standard for how you live your life, your conduct, your contribution to the community.
Precisely. It implies that real sovereignty isn't proven by arguing with a judge, but by demonstrating peaceful self-governance in your actions every day. But if we circle back one last time to that core mechanism, they describe the idea that the system primarily needs your compliance, not necessarily your informed awareness, and that compliance is so often given subtly, through language, through habits we don't examine. It leaves us with a really interesting question, a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after we finish here.
Considering just how subtly that consent can be given, maybe even unconsciously, what might be the unseen energetic cost of giving our consent day after day without full consciousness?
They say freedom is your birthright. But what if the world you were born into was built on contracts that you never signed? Beyond the Maritime Veil unveils the hidden systems that shape our lives, from the power of words to the unseen laws that govern us. It's time to see through the illusions and reclaim your sovereignty. Visit acknowledgementforward.com and begin your journey today. We'll see you on the other side.